A decorated war hero just publicly accused Prince Harry of betraying wounded veterans, and the whole room went silent. The room was packed with celebrities, influencers, athletes, and media moguls, all dressed in glittering suits and dresses, their smiles as polished as their designer shoes. It was the 2025 ESPY Awards, a night built on inspiration, perseverance, and stories of triumph over adversity. The cameras glided across the crowd, catching red carpet glamour, laughter at polished jokes from the evening's host, and the glow of carefully rehearsed tributes. But nothing, not even in the wildest expectations of the event's producers, could have prepared the world for what came next. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. And it certainly wasn't in the teleprompter. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Sergeant Israel Del Toro, a man who once lay near death on a battlefield, his body engulfed in flames, his future written off by every medical prediction, walked onto the stage with calm but unmistakable purpose. The room fell quiet. Most expected another emotional speech about recovery, about service, about grit. Instead, what they got was a blistering accusation, a voice of fury carefully controlled, and the shocking exposure of one of the evening's most celebrated figures, Prince Harry. This award, this room, this moment, Del Toro began, voice steady, jaw clenched, is supposed to honor those who gave everything. But how do we honor that sacrifice when some of the very people entrusted to protect it, to uplift it, turn it into a brand? The audience froze. The camera panned toward Prince Harry seated beside Meghan Markle. His expression shifted from polite attention to startled confusion. Meghan's signature stoic smile seemed to flicker. The air turned thick. Del Toro continued. I gave my body for my country. Many in this room did. And we didn't do it so our pain could be turned into a Netflix storyline. That money was meant to help men who left limbs on the battlefield. It wasn't meant to fund luxury travel, red carpet promotions, or private jets for the sake of an image. You could hear a pin drop, then gasps, then the kind of uneasy, spontaneous clapping that breaks out when the audience is unsure if they're witnessing bravery or witnessing a scandal being born. In that moment, Sergeant Del Toro did something that shattered the sheen of the evening and punctured the image of a man once praised as the compassionate royal warrior. He didn't just criticize Prince Harry. He accused him. He named him. He broke through the veil of celebrity polish and forced the world to look. But who is Sergeant Israel Del Toro? What prompted him to call out a royal in such a public and unforgiving way? And perhaps more urgently, is there truth to his claim? To understand why that single speech sent shockwaves far beyond the glittering halls of the ESPYs, why it set social media ablaze, triggered calls for audits, and raised suspicions across both veteran and donor communities, we must go deeper. Because this wasn't just a fiery outburst. It was the eruption of years of silence, tension, and betrayal buried beneath carefully curated press statements and choreographed charity footage. At the center of this firestorm is a war hero who survived a 500-degree explosion in Afghanistan, who was given a 15% chance to live, who lost fingers and sustained burns over 80% of his body, and who still returned to mentor, advocate, and inspire others. At the other center is Prince Harry, once celebrated for bringing the Invictus Games into the world, lauded for his empathy, his service, and his decision to champion injured veterans across the globe. But something changed. Over time, as cameras replaced care and streaming platforms overtook quiet acts of support, the Invictus mission began to shift. Or so claimed many who'd once stood proudly behind it. Sergeant Del Toro's words hit a nerve because they didn't sound rehearsed. They didn't sound politically calibrated. They sounded like a wound being ripped open. There was no PR filter, just anger born of perceived betrayal. And the world listened. Within minutes, clips of his speech went viral. Hashtags surged across Twitter and Instagram, and headlines began to flood the digital landscape. Prince Harry accused of misusing Invictus funds. Veteran hero explodes at ESPYs. Del Toro drops bombshell on royal charity. News anchors scrambled to find statements from the Invictus Foundation, Archwell, and Buckingham Palace. There were none. Just silence. But behind the silence was a growing body of evidence, testimonies, and financial records that hinted at something rotten beneath the royal gloss. Allegations began resurfacing that the Netflix-backed documentary series Heart of Invictus, produced by Archwell Productions, had consumed an unusual portion of Invictus's donor-raised budget. that travel expenses for promotional tours were excessive, that actual veterans waiting for critical support saw delays, while camera crews were flown overseas to capture the right angle. Del Toro's speech was not a lonely act of rebellion. It was the torch that lit a pile of long-ignored kindling. Other veterans began to speak out. Some called for audits. Others demanded Prince Harry step down as figurehead of Invictus. A former donor, once proud to contribute, said in an interview just days after the ESPYs, "I feel like I gave money to help heroes, not to help Harry make himself look like one." Suddenly, Prince Harry's team was in crisis mode. Archwell declined comment. PR firms scrambled. Meghan Markle, once praised for her production savvy and bringing veteran stories to screen, now faced sharp criticism. Was she commodifying trauma? Was this about empathy or optics? This wasn't merely a PR disaster. This was the unraveling of a narrative that had been meticulously constructed since Harry and Meghan's exit from royal life. A narrative that positioned them not as fleeing aristocrats, but as compassionate outsiders determined to do good in a world where the monarchy wouldn't let them. And now, a decorated U.S. war veteran was calling it all into question, not with petty gossip, but with the weight of lived experience and moral indignation. What follows in this investigation is more than just a retelling of one explosive moment. It is a forensic examination of how celebrity culture, charitable intention, and media manipulation can collide in the most dangerous ways. It's about what happens when the people meant to be helped become a marketing tool. When donors become unwitting funders of vanity. When silence becomes complicity. In this video, we'll trace the full arc, from the founding of the Invictus Games to the emergence of Archwell, from the production of Heart of Invictus to the chilling silence of its beneficiaries. We'll dig into where the money actually went, who benefited, and why Sergeant Del Toro's speech may be remembered not as an interruption, but as a reckoning. But most of all, we will listen to the voices that often go unheard beneath celebrity glitz, the wounded soldiers, the overlooked families, the veterans who traded limbs and livelihoods not for applause, but for quiet dignity and support. Because at the heart of this controversy is not just a prince, or a war hero, or even a single charity. It's a question that echoes louder than any viral speech. When pain becomes profit, who's really being served? Let the investigation begin. Who is Sergeant Israel Del Toro? To fully understand the magnitude of Sergeant Israel Del Toro's explosive moment on the ESPY stage, we must first step back from the glare of spotlights and enter the gritty, unforgiving world where his story began. It is in that crucible of war, trauma, and relentless survival that his voice earned its authority. This was not a celebrity lashing out for attention. This was a man who once walked through hell, dragging himself out of the abyss not for fame, but for the hope that others could follow him. Del Toro isn't a media construct. He is the embodiment of everything the Invictus Games claim to represent. So when he speaks out, the world listens because it knows he paid in blood for the right to be heard. Born in Joliet, Illinois, Del Toro grew up in a modest household. His life was never meant to intersect with red carpets or royal scandals. His father died when he was 12, and the sense of responsibility forced him to grow up fast. Family meant everything to him. It was this deep-rooted commitment to duty and sacrifice that led him to enlist in the United States Air Force. He served as a tactical air control party operator, a position that placed him on the front lines, coordinating airstrikes and directly engaging with combat forces. He wasn't behind a desk or miles from danger. Del Toro was there, in the dirt, in the chaos, with the sounds of gunfire and the weight of decisions that could end or save lives. Everything changed on December 4, 2005, in Afghanistan. While on a mission, his Humvee hit a roadside bomb. The explosion engulfed him in a 500-degree inferno. He was on fire for 4 minutes. Let that sink in. For minutes of burning alive. Doctors gave him a 15% chance of survival. His burns covered over 80% of his body. He lost fingers. His face, arms, and torso were disfigured beyond recognition. He was placed in a coma for nearly 3 months. And then he woke up. What followed was a series of battles that no battlefield could prepare him for. More than 100 surgeries. Endless pain. Physical therapy sessions that stretched his limits and tested his will. At one point, he couldn't breathe without assistance. His wife Carmen and their son were there, watching the man they loved fight for inches, for moments, for life. And he fought. Not just to walk again, but to return to active duty. Most people in his situation would have retired with honor. Del Toro aimed higher. He became the first 100% disabled airman to re-enlist in the Air Force and return to active service. This wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to himself and to the brothers and sisters in arms who'd been told their lives were effectively over. Del Toro became a symbol, not just of survival, but of relentless purpose. He didn't just want to survive his injuries, he wanted to transform them into strength for others. He began speaking at veteran events, mentoring injured soldiers, and later working as an instructor to train new recruits. His impact grew, not through branding, but through authentic presence. When the Invictus Games launched in 2014, spearheaded by Prince Harry, Del Toro was an obvious choice to be part of it. The games were designed to celebrate wounded warriors, to give them a platform to compete, connect, and reclaim identity through sport and camaraderie. Del Toro didn't just compete. He became a pillar of the Invictus community. He was seen laughing with athletes, motivating them in training, and pushing himself to new limits. To many, he was the walking spirit of the games. He participated in cycling and shot put, and even in the opening ceremonies of later games, he was often positioned prominently, sometimes next to Prince Harry himself. Their interactions appeared warm and genuine. Harry would reference Del Toro in speeches. They exchanged hugs, jokes, shared tears. Their bond seemed forged in mutual respect. It made what happened at the 2025 ESPYs all the more jarring. This wasn't a stranger taking a cheap shot. This was a brother in arms saying, "You let us down." Over the years, Del Toro continued his advocacy outside of Invictus. He published a memoir titled A Patriot's Promise, detailing his journey through trauma and resilience. He was awarded the Pat Tillman Award for Service at the 2017 ESPYs, long before this recent appearance. He traveled the country, speaking to schools, veterans, and medical staff. He remained humble but outspoken, often challenging bureaucracy, inefficiency, and exploitation of veterans by corporate or political interests. So when he took the ESPY stage in 2025, it wasn't as a bitter man with an axe to grind. It was as someone with years of lived experience, disappointment, and growing concern about how a cause he believed in was being hijacked. In interviews prior to the ESPYs, Del Toro had hinted at unease. He had voiced frustration at how storytelling around veterans was becoming overly polished, selective, and sanitized. "We're not all picture-perfect comeback stories," he once said in a podcast. "Some of us are still in the thick of it. And pretending like we're all fixed because it looks better on screen, that's dangerous." There were signs, if people had been paying attention. Whispers in the veteran community about how much money actually reached athletes. Stories about disabled competitors being left to crowdfund for equipment while production teams flew business class. Invictus wasn't just a sports event, it had become a brand. And Del Toro, once its proud face, had watched as the soul of the movement was slowly replaced by commercial sheen. What hurt most, according to those close to him, was the sense of betrayal. Prince Harry had once been lauded for putting veterans first, for shedding tears with them, for showing up even when cameras weren't rolling. But now, Harry was behind a polished series deal with Netflix. Now, Archwell Productions had creative control. Now, the narratives were tight, dramatic, made for global audiences, and some veterans felt their realities had been cropped out to serve a narrative. Del Toro kept his concerns quiet at first. He was warned by some to tread carefully. Harry was still royalty, still powerful. But the moment came when silence was no longer tolerable. As he stepped onto that ESPY stage in 2025, he knew what he was doing. He knew the backlash that might follow. But to him, it wasn't about optics, it was about honor. About reclaiming the mission that had once given so many wounded warriors a reason to rise again. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't seek headlines. But in speaking his truth, Del Toro opened a floodgate. In the days after his speech, hundreds of veterans sent him messages of support. Some offered to come forward with their own stories. A few critics tried to downplay his claims, citing lack of financial evidence. But Del Toro remained firm. "This isn't about hating Harry," he said in a statement. "It's about protecting the soul of something we all believed in." The world now sees Sergeant Israel Del Toro not just as a survivor, but as a whistleblower. A warrior not only on the battlefield, but in a world of egos, brands, and blurred missions. He is, in many ways, the perfect contradiction to the modern celebrity activist, scarred, unscripted, and utterly unafraid to speak hard truths. And that is what gives his voice power. That is why his accusation landed with such force. Because when Del Toro speaks, he doesn't need a script. His story already says enough. What really happened at the ESPY Awards? The ESPY Awards are typically an evening of polished pageantry. It's where athletes are honored not just for physical greatness, but for courage, inspiration, and perseverance. This is not the kind of arena where drama typically erupts. But on the night of July 10th, 2025, something happened that shattered that expectation. It wasn't just a moment of controversy, it was a cultural collision between spectacle and substance, between celebrity and sacrifice. And it unfolded on live television, before a room filled with America's biggest names and millions of viewers across the world. The night began like any other high-end awards show. Lights beamed from the ceiling like searchlights calling the stars to attention. The red carpet saw waves of glitz and glamour as high-profile athletes rubbed shoulders with actors, musicians, and influencers. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, dressed in coordinated black and silver ensembles, arrived just as the pre-show commentary hit its peak. Meghan smiled for the cameras. Harry gave his usual half-grin. There was anticipation around their appearance. The couple was scheduled to present an award for Best Athlete with a Disability, a segment that many assumed would also include a short tribute to the Invictus Games. Harry had presented at the ESPYs before, and while his presence stirred media attention, it was usually a safe, non-political moment in the show. That safety shattered around halfway through the evening. The presenter introducing Sergeant Israel Del Toro did so with reverence, listing his military accolades, referencing his injuries, and hailing him as a symbol of perseverance. As Del Toro made his way to the podium, the applause was thunderous. For many, he was the human embodiment of sacrifice and triumph. A man who'd walked through fire, literally, and returned not only to tell his story, but to ensure others could write their own. He began calmly. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried a gravity that stilled the murmuring tables and quieted the background shuffling of producers and crew. At first, it seemed like the kind of speech one would expect from a veteran honoree, a thank you to those who supported him, a message of hope to others still battling trauma. But within the first 30 seconds, Del Toro veered into dangerous territory. "This is a night to honor stories of courage," he said, "but it's also a night to tell the truth." Cameras stayed fixed on his scarred face, while in the control room, directors tensed. They weren't sure what was coming, but his tone made it clear it wouldn't be rehearsed. "I've been part of the Invictus Games since the early days," he continued, "and I believed in it. We all did. It was about recovery, about dignity, about helping veterans find their strength again." A close-up cut to Prince Harry at his table. He was smiling lightly, perhaps unsure of what Del Toro was building up to. Meghan appeared more composed, her gaze fixed and unreadable. But somewhere along the line, Del Toro said slowly, that mission was hijacked. What started as healing turned into headlines. What was meant to be about us, the wounded, the struggling, the invisible, became about someone else's image. The crowd began shifting. Some gasped audibly. Others looked nervously at their tables. Del Toro didn't pause. "I watched as the money meant for our brothers and sisters went into glossy trailers, red carpet interviews, Netflix cameras. I watched our stories get packaged, not to help us, but to promote someone's brand. Prince Harry, I respected you. I fought for what you stood for. But you let us down." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The camera lingered on Harry, who no longer smiled. His face stiffened. Meghan's hand moved slowly to his shoulder. They didn't move. No reaction from their table. But the energy in the room shifted like a blast wave. Del Toro's voice cracked slightly, but he powered forward. That money wasn't meant to launch a Netflix series. It wasn't meant to fly executives around the world or build media empires. That money was supposed to help a man who came home without legs feel like he could still compete. It was supposed to help the woman who came back with trauma so deep she couldn't face daylight feel like she wasn't alone. From a corner of the stage, a producer could be seen signaling to cut the mic, but it was too late. Del Toro's final words had already landed. "If we don't speak up now, we betray the very people we claim to serve. I won't stay silent. Not anymore." And just like that, he stepped away from the podium. No music played. No transition. The show was stunned. For a full 10 seconds, the silence was total. Then came an awkward smattering of applause, then a rising roar. It wasn't entirely celebratory, it was confused, reactive, explosive. Some stood. Others remained frozen. Meghan and Harry stayed seated. Meghan's expression was unreadable. Harry leaned forward, head down slightly, face caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled. Was this a security breach? A rogue speaker? No. Del Toro had been booked. No one had anticipated what he'd say. Within seconds, clips from the speech hit social media. Viewers watching at home flooded Twitter with hashtags. Hashtag Del Toro Truth. Hashtag Invictus Scam. Hashtag Harry Exposed. The night, which had been meant to honor athletes, had taken a sharp turn into scandal. It wasn't just the fact that Del Toro had called out Prince Harry by name. It was how he did it. Calm, clear, unafraid. He didn't yell. He didn't make wild accusations. He spoke with the quiet fury of someone who had been holding back for too long. That's what made it land like a punch to the gut. News outlets didn't wait for the event to end. By the time the show resumed, multiple headlines were already published. Veteran calls out Prince Harry at ESPYs. Sergeant Del Toro accuses Harry of Invictus misuse. Shock speech interrupts award show. In the aftermath, producers released a vague statement about respecting all perspectives. ESPN, the network airing the show, attempted to soften the blow with carefully curated post-show commentary. But it was clear, the damage was done. The show was no longer the story. Del Toro's speech was. Calls for accountability started almost immediately. Viewers, especially veterans and donors, began posting screenshots of their past contributions to Invictus-linked causes and demanding transparency. A former board member of a military charity tweeted, "That speech was long overdue. We've seen signs for years." Behind closed doors, the Archwell crisis team was reportedly caught off guard. The plan had been to reframe Harry and Meghan's public image after a tumultuous year of press criticism and declining influence. Instead, they were now facing one of their most direct and damning public confrontations, and from a decorated war hero, no less. Meghan's team later leaked a background quote to the press, hinting that Del Toro may have been manipulated by detractors. But the response backfired. Many viewed it as dismissive, even insulting to a man who had earned every scar he bore. The ESPY producers were also flooded with requests from news outlets asking for the raw footage of the speech. Veteran groups issued open letters supporting Del Toro and demanding an independent audit of Invictus-related spending. Some politicians began to take notice. By the next morning, it was clear the scandal was not going to fade. Del Toro had not just shaken a room. He had rattled an institution. And whether his speech was the first domino or just the loudest so far, there was no doubt anymore that Prince Harry's connection to the Invictus Games, once his most noble and unassailable achievement, was now under a microscope. Prince Harry and the Invictus Games legacy. To grasp the full weight of Sergeant Israel Del Toro's rebuke, one must first understand the world Prince Harry built, and then how that world began to unravel. Before the Netflix deals, before the Archwell controversies, and long before the ESPY fallout, there was the Invictus Games, a project born not out of political ambition or personal branding, but out of something that felt rare in the modern age, raw empathy. For a while, that empathy made Prince Harry more than just a royal, it made him a symbol. The soldier who hadn't merely served, but who brought the wounded into the light. The man who saw their broken bodies not as scars, but as stories. But now, the very creation that once elevated him is being turned back on him. To understand why that reversal has become so powerful and damning, we have to go back to the beginning. The Invictus Games were not conceived in a boardroom. They were born on the battlefield, shaped by Harry's own experience serving in Afghanistan. In 2007 and again in 2012, Prince Harry deployed to the front lines. He wasn't merely a royal mascot, he was trained, equipped, and embedded. He flew Apache helicopters. He saw trauma, death, loss. And he returned with something few royals ever bring back from war, a sense of personal mission. In 2013, after witnessing the Warrior Games in the United States, a sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick military personnel, Harry returned to the UK inspired. He envisioned a global, royal-backed version of those games that could serve not just as a sporting platform, but as a healing experience. It would be called the Invictus Games, from the Latin for unconquered. A powerful name for warriors who had survived what most would never even endure. The first Invictus Games were held in London in 2014. At the opening ceremony, Harry delivered an emotional address. He spoke of invisible wounds, of dignity, of camaraderie. The crowd rose in standing ovation, and the veterans who competed in those first games became symbols of triumph not just over injury, but over isolation and invisibility. Harry didn't just create the games, he became their face. And for a time, it was a perfect union. Media praised his authenticity. Veterans spoke warmly of his unfiltered presence behind the scenes. Unlike most public figures, Harry didn't just show up for cameras. He laughed with athletes, cried with them, trained alongside them. His support felt real, rooted in personal pain and fraternal responsibility. It was this connection that made Invictus a globally admired initiative. From London to Orlando, from Toronto to Sydney, each games brought more visibility, more stories, and more participants. The event wasn't just about sport, it was about transformation. In the years that followed, Prince Harry would reference Invictus whenever his public image came under strain. After stepping back from royal duties in 2020, he used it as a point of moral authority, a reminder that even without titles, he was still serving something bigger than himself. Interviews, documentaries, speeches all regularly circled back to Invictus. It became both shield and sword in his media battle against the British press and monarchy critics. The Games expanded, gained partnerships, and cultivated deep ties to governments, charities, and donors across continents. Harry formed the Invictus Games Foundation to manage the operations. The foundation accepted sponsorships, handled logistics, and received direct donations from individuals and institutions moved by the cause. By 2022, the Games had drawn in millions of pounds in charitable contributions. More than just a sporting event, it was now a movement, a cultural moment, a royal legacy in its own right. But every legacy that grows too fast, too wide, too globally influential, eventually invites scrutiny. And by 2023, cracks began to show. Veterans behind the scenes whispered about increasing bureaucracy, delays in promised support, budget disputes. A few competitors noted that while the press events grew grander, the actual services provided didn't always follow suit. Some veterans were frustrated that media focus seemed to center more on Harry than on the athletes themselves. Yet these concerns were mostly hushed or brushed off. Few dared question the man who had put them on a world stage. The loyalty to Harry, for many, remained intact, until Archewell entered the picture. Archewell Productions, the media arm created by Harry and Meghan after stepping back from the royal family, announced in 2022 that it would begin filming a Netflix documentary centered on Invictus. The goal, according to its promotional material, was to capture the human stories behind the uniforms. The series would be called Heart of Invictus. At first, many welcomed the news. More visibility, more stories, more inspiration. What could go wrong? But as production began, insiders noted a shift in priorities. Schedules were rewritten to accommodate film crews. Athletes were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to appear in scenes that were narratively significant. One competitor, who later asked to remain anonymous, said, "It started feeling less like the Invictus Games and more like a set. We were characters in a production." Worse, questions started emerging about funding. While Archewell was technically producing the documentary separately, there were overlaps. Promotional events for the series were billed under Invictus but tied into Netflix premieres. Flights for press tours blurred lines between charity and commercial. And some insiders claimed that resources, especially media personnel and travel budgets, were increasingly being funneled into projects that served Archewell's public image more than Invictus's mission. Harry's defenders argued that visibility was part of the package. The more people knew about Invictus, the more money it could raise. But skeptics pushed back. Visibility for whom? And at what cost? Meanwhile, smaller issues began to snowball. Promised stipends for veteran competitors were delayed or reduced. Grants earmarked for local veteran support programs were quietly shelved. And when confronted, some officials in the Invictus Foundation seemed caught off guard. As one journalist from the London Herald wrote, the foundation had a clear problem. It had grown too big to manage with the intimacy and care it once promised. And in the vacuum, branding began to take priority over brotherhood. By early 2025, whispers had turned to documented grievances. At least 2 former staffers from the Invictus Games Foundation resigned, citing mission drift and conflicting directives from Archewell. A small group of athletes, in a private letter to the board, requested an independent audit of funds. That letter was reportedly ignored. This is the climate in which Sergeant Israel Del Toro found himself once again center stage, but this time, not to receive a medal, not to be honored, not to share a message of inspiration. He was there to deliver a warning, to say the quiet part out loud. And it hurt. Because for all his flaws, for all the missteps since stepping back from the royal family, Prince Harry's creation of the Invictus Games was, for many, his single most beautiful legacy. It was honest, grounded, needed, It gave thousands of veterans a sense of identity, belonging, and healing. But when a legacy becomes blurred with ambition, when loyalty is exchanged for leverage, and when wounded warriors feel used instead of uplifted, even the most noble work can collapse under its own weight. Del Toro's speech wasn't just an attack. It was a eulogy, not for the games themselves, but for what they once stood for. He wasn't just calling out Harry's choices. He was mourning the transformation of a mission he once believed in. As of now, the Invictus Games still operate. Events are planned for the following year. New athletes are still signing up. But the mythos around them, the idea that they are untouched by politics, unsullied by ego, has been irrevocably damaged. And so the question remains, can Prince Harry separate himself from the branding machine he helped create? Can the Invictus Games be rescued from the orbit of commercialism? Or will it become just another chapter in the long history of good intentions hijacked by the seduction of image? The Netflix deal and the branding machine. To truly grasp the turmoil ignited by Sergeant Israel Del Toro's shocking public accusation against Prince Harry, we must unravel one of the most critical and controversial chapters in the saga. The Netflix deal and its significant role in transforming the Invictus Games from a beacon of hope for wounded veterans into a lavish showcase of celebrity-driven storytelling. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from royal life in early 2020, the world held its breath. No one knew exactly what path the high-profile couple would take, only that they promised a more authentic life away from the relentless glare of British tabloids. However, rather than slipping quietly into obscurity, Harry and Meghan quickly pivoted toward Hollywood. They created Archwell Productions, a media entity designed to capitalize on their global influence and build a platform for their ideals and narratives. In September 2020, they secured a monumental deal with Netflix, reported to be worth around $100 million. The announcement came with the promise of socially conscious documentaries, children's programming, and inspirational storytelling centered around themes like compassion, resilience, and human spirit. Initially, it seemed like a natural fit. Harry and Meghan had positioned themselves as champions of humanitarian causes, diversity, and social justice. But even from the outset, the colossal price tag raised eyebrows. Critics questioned what precisely Netflix was buying. Was it Harry's royal cachet, Meghan's Hollywood charisma, or both? Or were they effectively purchasing the stories of those who had no idea their struggles would soon become streaming content for global consumption? One of Archwell's first major projects, announced with significant fanfare, was Heart of Invictus, a multi-part documentary series intended to chronicle the journeys of Invictus Games participants. At first glance, it seemed promising. Prince Harry, after all, had co-founded the Games and was considered by many the public face and emotional core of the initiative. The documentary was intended to provide deeper insight into the veterans' emotional and physical struggles, victories, and the camaraderie that defined their participation. But as production commenced, those close to Invictus quickly sensed that something was off. The Netflix deal brought with it a new, shiny Hollywood-style ethos that permeated every aspect of what was previously a humble, participant-driven event. Previously understated ceremonies turned into extravagant productions, with stages rivaling music festivals. Cameras seemed to multiply exponentially, capturing every emotional moment with cinematic precision, but at the expense of genuine spontaneity and privacy for the veterans involved. Insiders began voicing concerns. A volunteer who worked on multiple Invictus Games described how participants who previously competed quietly and courageously found themselves pressured into performing for the camera. "We started seeing more retakes," the volunteer said anonymously. Athletes being asked to repeat emotional conversations or to recreate intimate moments. It felt invasive. As production continued, veterans who had originally agreed enthusiastically to the documentary began expressing discomfort. Some openly questioned the motivations behind the series. Was this still about them, their healing, and their triumphs, or was it now about ratings, subscriptions, and streaming success? One of the key controversies revolved around funding. The Invictus Games Foundation, which relied heavily on donor contributions, was suddenly facing scrutiny about how resources were being allocated. Netflix, through Archwell Productions, technically funded the documentary's direct costs. However, investigations into the foundation's expenditures suggested significant overlaps. Travel costs for Archwell executives, lavish accommodations for camera crews, and promotional events tied explicitly to the Netflix release raised troubling questions. Was money intended for veterans inadvertently or deliberately, being diverted to serve promotional and commercial interests. Reports surfaced that staff from Archwell Productions traveled extensively in first-class accommodations, stayed at five-star hotels, and hosted extravagant dinners, all billed as production costs. In contrast, participating veterans often struggled to obtain basic funding for adaptive sporting equipment, transportation to training events, or psychological counseling services, core elements of the Invictus mission. As one veteran anonymously told a reporter, "We were fundraising for wheelchairs and training facilities, while Netflix crews traveled in luxury." Archwell and Netflix dismissed such accusations as misunderstandings or exaggerations, asserting that any spending directly related to Invictus athletes was strictly managed and transparently accounted for. But as public and internal scrutiny intensified, tensions heightened behind the scenes. Sources within Archwell described a growing rift between Meghan Markle's creative oversight and those responsible for veteran care. Markle, heavily involved in the creative direction of the documentary, reportedly pushed for dramatic, emotionally charged narratives, ensuring each episode contained compelling arcs and dramatic tension. Her experience in Hollywood made her an effective storyteller, but some within Invictus argued this approach trivialized real suffering and turned genuine trauma into mere spectacle. One high-ranking Invictus Games official reportedly resigned quietly in 2024, privately citing discomfort with the direction of the documentary. Leaked internal emails later revealed frustration over increasingly intrusive filming practices and concerns about the shifting focus toward ratings rather than rehabilitation. The situation escalated when details of Archwell's expenditures became public in early 2025, mere months before Sergeant Israel Del Toro's explosive ESPY speech. A detailed investigation by a respected veterans advocacy watchdog group revealed troubling specifics. According to leaked financial documents, expenses earmarked as promotional efforts significantly outpaced actual grants and direct support given to veterans competing in the Games. One glaring example cited was the discrepancy between the marketing budget allocated to promote part of Invictus and actual funds spent on adaptive equipment and psychological support services. For every dollar spent directly assisting veterans, approximately $5 were allocated toward promotional events, social media advertising, premieres, and travel expenses for celebrity guests and Archwell executives. These revelations severely damaged the credibility of both Archwell and Prince Harry himself, whose public image had long been intertwined with his veteran advocacy. Harry's previous reputation as a sincere, frontline ally to wounded veterans now faced direct criticism. Accusations of exploiting veteran stories for personal and financial gain became commonplace, not just among critical media voices, but increasingly among veterans themselves. In the aftermath, a number of high-profile sponsors and donors publicly withdrew support or quietly chose not to renew their commitments. Foundations that once proudly displayed the Invictus logo began quietly removing it from their public-facing materials. Harry's personal credibility, previously rock-solid within the veteran community, faced significant erosion. Further exacerbating matters was the aggressive public relations response orchestrated by Archwell. The foundation attempted to counter criticism with carefully curated statements, deflecting blame onto external media's sensationalism and asserting a continued commitment to veteran care. However, the defensive nature of these responses often backfired, reinforcing perceptions of arrogance or entitlement rather than genuine contrition or transparency. In private, sources close to Harry revealed he felt deeply conflicted. According to insiders, he expressed regret at how commercial imperatives increasingly overshadowed Invictus's original, altruistic mission. But by this point, disentangling the Games from Archwell and Netflix appeared nearly impossible, given the complexity of financial ties and public commitments. When Sergeant Israel Del Toro finally confronted Harry publicly at the ESPYs, it was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of internal conflict, unchecked ambition, and growing disillusionment. Del Toro's words resonated not because they were shocking, but because they vocalized what many veterans and insiders had quietly feared or suspected for months. In the immediate aftermath, Netflix reportedly held crisis meetings to assess potential reputational damage. While publicly the company maintained a neutral stance, privately, executives worried that the negative publicity could overshadow future projects with Archwell. The streaming giant's patience for controversy had clear limits, even if Harry and Meghan's star power remained valuable. Ultimately, the Netflix deal symbolized a broader cultural shift within Invictus and Harry's personal brand, a move from genuine humanitarian effort toward entertainment spectacle and lucrative self-promotion. This shift wasn't sudden. It had evolved gradually, influenced by celebrity culture, immense financial incentives, and the pressures of maintaining global media visibility. The scandal revealed the perilous reality of merging charitable causes with commercial enterprise. While Harry and Meghan had initially aimed to leverage their fame for positive impact, the boundaries quickly blurred and motivations became muddled. A project initially celebrated as groundbreaking and noble was now viewed by many as compromised and exploitative. For Prince Harry, the Netflix deal became both his greatest commercial triumph and his deepest moral crisis. It enriched him and elevated his global profile but simultaneously undermined the very authenticity he'd sought to establish outside the royal family. The revelations surrounding Invictus damaged not only his reputation but the trust of those who once viewed him as their genuine champion. And now, as Netflix prepares to premiere Heart of Invictus, viewers must ask a painful question. Are these stories truly told to honor veterans, or are they simply another form of entertainment designed to boost subscription numbers, leaving the very people they claim to uplift wondering if their sacrifice has merely become another compelling storyline? The accusations made by Sergeant Israel Del Toro during his explosive appearance at the 2025 ESPY Awards struck a nerve far deeper than mere celebrity drama. At the heart of his blistering indictment lay an uncomfortable question that demanded urgent investigation. Where exactly had the substantial donations meant for the Invictus Games ended up? As journalists, watchdog groups, and concerned donors began pulling at threads, the story they uncovered was more troubling and significantly murkier than anyone had anticipated. When Prince Harry established the Invictus Games Foundation in 2014, donors around the globe enthusiastically rallied behind the initiative. Its purpose resonated profoundly, supporting wounded veterans not just through sporting events, but also through genuine resources, rehabilitation programs, and critical psychological assistance. Over the years, hundreds of millions poured into the organization's coffers, a testament to Harry's passionate advocacy and the inspirational stories of resilience showcased at each event. Yet, as the Games grew in visibility, complexity, and ambition, particularly following Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's lucrative Netflix partnership, questions began swirling around how the foundation managed its finances. To many, the rapid expansion into global media territory seemed to outpace the core charitable mission, prompting justified concerns among loyal donors and devoted supporters. A deeper dive into the Invictus Games Foundation's financial records painted an unsettling picture. Publicly available reports initially showed what appeared to be healthy distributions, veteran rehabilitation programs, adaptive sports equipment, and grants to various support initiatives. But as independent watchdog groups dug deeper, they uncovered discrepancies that raised alarms. It soon became clear that a significant portion of the funds was not directly supporting veterans or rehabilitation efforts. Instead, large sums had quietly found their way into operational overhead and, notably, marketing budgets directly benefiting Archwell Productions' Netflix venture. Initially, the narrative offered by Foundation spokespeople suggested these expenses were justifiable and strategic. They argued that global visibility through Netflix's documentaries would ultimately drive more donor contributions, amplifying long-term support for veterans. However, this justification quickly crumbled under intense scrutiny. In early 2025, a confidential whistleblower report emerged from within the Invictus Games Foundation itself. Leaked first to a respected veterans advocacy website, the document detailed troubling specifics, including lavish travel expenses, extensive payments to high-profile consultants, and expenditures labeled ambiguously as content creation costs. Most alarmingly, it revealed that substantial amounts labeled as charitable grants were, in fact, directly funding promotional activities closely tied to Netflix and Archwell. A notable revelation was the budget for the Heart of Invictus premiere events. Investigations revealed these lavish promotional events, held in luxury venues worldwide, incurred enormous expenses. Elite catering, high-end accommodations, private security, and luxury transportation were billed under ambiguous accounting categories. Shockingly, expenses attributed to these Netflix launch events exceeded the entire annual budget set aside for direct psychological counseling and rehabilitation grants to veterans. Further scrutiny revealed another concerning issue: the foundation's increasingly opaque financial structure. Under pressure to scale rapidly, the Invictus Foundation had expanded its management ranks dramatically. By 2025, the payroll included not only administrative staff but also several high-paid executives with ambiguous roles directly tied to Archwell Productions. High-level consultants, many connected to Meghan Markle's previous Hollywood networks, earned salaries rivaling corporate executives. One senior executive reportedly earned over $350,000 annually, a figure critics argued was wildly disproportionate for a charitable organization of Invictus's original mandate. Transparency, previously a hallmark of the Invictus brand, was quietly compromised. Detailed financial breakdowns, once readily available in annual reports, became progressively less specific after 2023. Stakeholders complained that expense categories were increasingly generalized, making it impossible to track precisely how donations were used. Alarmingly, multiple donors who reached out seeking clarification or transparency were reportedly met with vague reassurances or silence, fueling further suspicion. As these revelations spilled into public view, previous donors expressed disillusionment. Mark Elliott, a prominent philanthropist who had previously donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to Invictus, openly expressed regret. In a widely circulated interview, he stated, "When I contributed, I genuinely believed my money would help wounded veterans rebuild their lives. Instead, I see lavish film premieres, Netflix promotions, and glossy events. I'm deeply disappointed and disillusioned." Other large donors echoed Elliott's sentiment, demanding clarity. Several corporations, including international banks and major tech companies, quietly scaled back their support. Prominent foundations that once proudly displayed their association with Invictus removed references from their websites, signaling a quiet but powerful withdrawal of public support. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking consequences came from veterans themselves. Competitors who had eagerly anticipated receiving vital financial support and assistance from Invictus expressed frustration. A former competitor in wheelchair basketball, struggling financially to afford crucial training equipment, revealed he had to turn to personal crowdfunding campaigns after promised Invictus funds mysteriously never materialized. "We were told resources were limited, yet Netflix crews traveled first class, filming events we couldn't even afford to participate in," he bitterly noted. These sentiments reinforced the perception that Invictus had veered dangerously off its initial path. Some staff members within Invictus privately expressed regret over this dramatic transformation. One internal email leaked in mid-2025 stated plainly, "We are spending far more on public relations and narrative control than on veteran welfare itself. This is unsustainable." As pressure intensified, Prince Harry's own credibility as Invictus's founder and figurehead came under severe strain. Although he initially attempted to distance himself publicly from day-to-day financial management, sources close to him privately revealed he was increasingly distressed. According to insiders, Harry was caught between his genuine desire to support veterans and the uncomfortable reality of Archwell's aggressive branding strategy. Yet, as the face of Invictus, responsibility inevitably fell upon him, eroding the trust he had painstakingly built among the veteran community. In the weeks following Sergeant Del Toro's dramatic SB speech, multiple veteran advocacy groups and watchdog organizations openly demanded an independent financial audit of Invictus's expenditures. A Change.org petition rapidly gained hundreds of thousands of signatures. Even political figures began weighing in. Senator Deborah Hayes publicly called for regulatory bodies in both the UK and US to examine potential misuse of charitable donations. "Veterans deserve transparency, respect, and accountability, not exploitation," she declared. Yet, despite public pressure, Archwell Productions and Invictus officials maintained a cautious, defensive stance. Press releases reiterated their commitment to veterans, highlighted success stories, and dismissed critical claims as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Still, beneath this official stance lay clear signs of internal turmoil. Several high-ranking executives quietly resigned, and multiple mid-level staff expressed discomfort privately over the moral compromises being made. At the core of this scandal was a critical question about charitable accountability. How could a foundation that began with noble intent become so entangled in commercialism and self-promotion? While Harry initially envisioned Invictus as a beacon of veteran support, by 2025, it had become undeniably associated with celebrity image-making and lucrative entertainment contracts. What Sergeant Del Toro exposed was not just potential mismanagement or overspending. He revealed something deeper, a disturbing cultural shift where charitable initiatives could be quietly hijacked by branding imperatives, blurring the line between philanthropy and profiteering. Now, in the aftermath, the Invictus Games Foundation faces a pivotal moment. Public trust is deeply damaged. Donors, veterans, and stakeholders demand urgent reforms. The Netflix deal, originally seen as a remarkable opportunity, now threatens to overshadow Invictus's legacy completely. Prince Harry himself faces an uncomfortable reckoning. Can he reconcile his noble intentions with the reality of commercial compromises? Sergeant Del Toro's speech was more than just an outburst. It ignited a critical public conversation about ethics and charity, celebrity influence, and the vital need for transparency. At stake is not merely Invictus's reputation but the fundamental trust people place in those who claim to champion humanitarian causes. In the end, this financial controversy highlights a painful truth. Without strict accountability, even the most admirable causes risk being corrupted by the seductive allure of celebrity and commerce. Invictus Games, once celebrated for empowering veterans, must now urgently address this reality or risk losing everything it originally stood for. When Sergeant Israel Del Toro stepped onto the SB stage and publicly confronted Prince Harry about the perceived misuse of Invictus Games funds, he did more than just ignite a scandal. He opened a floodgate. For many veterans who had privately harbored similar doubts or frustrations, Del Toro's bravery served as both catalyst and permission. In the weeks that followed, the voices previously silenced by loyalty, hope, or fear began to speak with newfound clarity, urgency, and determination. Initially, these voices emerged cautiously. Veterans, after all, are accustomed to loyalty, honor, and the bonds of brotherhood, concepts deeply ingrained through shared sacrifice and service. Publicly criticizing Invictus or Prince Harry, a figure long admired within military circles, felt almost unthinkable. Yet once Del Toro stepped forward, these concerns could no longer remain buried. One of the first veterans to publicly express solidarity with Del Toro was former Marine Corps Sergeant Alex Crawford. Crawford had participated in the Invictus Games twice and had proudly credited the event with saving his life. However, he revealed in a poignant social media post that he had grown disillusioned over the previous year, feeling increasingly like a mere prop in a marketing campaign. Crawford wrote, "When I first joined Invictus, it was about camaraderie and recovery. But recently, it feels more like we're stage managed for television. My PTSD isn't a storyline, it's my life. I stood by silently because I didn't want to damage something I once loved. But silence feels impossible now." Crawford's heartfelt post quickly went viral, resonating deeply with other veterans who shared similar sentiments. Within days, more participants stepped forward, emboldened by Crawford's candor. One particularly impactful account came from retired British Army Corporal Sarah Wentworth. Wentworth had lost her right leg serving in Iraq and competed in cycling events at the 2023 Invictus Games. Though initially hesitant, she decided it was essential to speak up. In an emotional podcast interview, she explained, "I signed up for Invictus to reclaim myself. Instead, I found cameras everywhere, constantly pushed to retell traumatic memories, to cry on cue. It began feeling exploitative, not empowering." Wentworth recounted an instance when producers encouraged her to repeat emotional moments multiple times, asking her to appear more distressed for dramatic effect. She explained, "I felt like a performer, not a veteran recovering from trauma. It was heartbreaking." These candid stories began accumulating rapidly, adding undeniable weight to Del Toro's initial accusations. The veteran community, usually reserved and cautious in public discourse, was now openly discussing their frustrations with Invictus and Archwell's approach. Another powerful voice belonged to Army veteran Matthew Jennings, who competed in wheelchair rugby. Jennings revealed that while his initial Invictus experience was transformative, he grew increasingly concerned by how the event shifted following Archwell's Netflix agreement. In a televised interview, Jennings bluntly stated, "It stopped being about us, plain and simple. We went from rehabilitation to entertainment. We could barely get basic funding for new wheelchairs, but they had money to fly Netflix producers around first class. Something's deeply wrong." Jennings' remarks resonated profoundly, prompting even more voices to join the chorus. Navy veteran and gold medalist wheelchair basketball player Kevin Alvarez described frustration at how funding seemed consistently diverted to promotional events rather than core athlete support. When I asked why our training grants were cut, I was told funds were tight, Alvarez recounted. Yet, at the next games, Netflix banners and lavish stages appeared everywhere. It didn't add up. These stories weren't isolated, nor were they simply complaints. They formed a coherent picture of a broader issue, an organization seemingly prioritizing public relations and commercial branding over genuine veteran care. Each voice provided another critical piece of evidence supporting Del Toro's passionate claim that the Invictus Games had strayed dangerously from their original mission. Adding further depth were testimonies from former Invictus staff members and volunteers who came forward anonymously, corroborating veterans' experiences. One longtime volunteer coordinator disclosed in a widely shared anonymous blog post that instructions from Archwell's production team increasingly took precedence over veteran care. The volunteer wrote, "We were explicitly instructed to ensure certain photogenic veterans received more camera time, resources, and attention. The quieter competitors, who didn't fit Archwell's desired narratives, often got pushed aside." These revelations sparked outrage among many veterans who previously assumed Invictus's uneven resource allocation was accidental or administrative. Now, it appeared deliberate, strategic, and deeply troubling. Not every veteran shared these critical perspectives. Some came forward to defend Prince Harry and the Invictus organization, insisting their experiences remained overwhelmingly positive. Retired Canadian Air Force pilot Mark Thompson publicly stated, "Invictus saved my life. Yes, it's changed, but the good it does far outweighs any negatives." Thompson emphasized that focusing solely on criticisms risked damaging an initiative that had profoundly benefited many veterans worldwide. However, even among defenders, an acknowledgement emerged that Invictus urgently needed reforms and transparency to regain trust. These voices did not dismiss critics outright. Instead, they argued that Invictus could and must be salvaged, strengthened, and return to its original mission of genuine veteran empowerment. In response, media organizations began actively facilitating these nuanced discussions. A major television network organized a televised roundtable featuring both critics and supporters from within the veteran community, creating a balanced dialogue that deepened public understanding of the controversy's complexity. During this televised discussion, retired Sergeant Marcus Taylor powerfully summed up prevailing sentiment. "We're grateful for Invictus, but gratitude doesn't mean silence. If something is wrong, veterans have every right, even duty, to demand accountability. We fought for transparency and integrity overseas. We shouldn't abandon those principles here at home." In the wake of these revelations, a prominent advocacy group for wounded veterans launched an independent inquiry to gather comprehensive testimonies from participants, volunteers, and staff. Within weeks, over 300 detailed submissions poured in, highlighting widespread frustration and calls for immediate organizational change. This report ultimately recommended stringent new governance rules, mandatory spending transparency, and clear separation of commercial partnerships from core charitable activities. Veterans' collective voices also impacted the donor community significantly, as personal testimonies revealed discrepancies between public-facing promises and behind-the-scenes reality. Previously loyal donors began publicly expressing concerns. Several major corporate sponsors issued statements affirming their commitment to supporting veterans, but emphasized future donations would depend explicitly on renewed transparency and tangible reforms. Amidst growing pressure, Prince Harry himself reportedly reached out privately to several vocal critics within the veteran community, seeking dialogue and expressing a willingness to listen. These private conversations reportedly reflected genuine anguish, acknowledging that mistakes had been made. Yet, public responses from Archwell Productions remained cautious and defensive, exacerbating veterans' frustration. Many felt official statements consistently prioritized protecting Archwell's image over sincerely addressing veteran grievances. As voices continued to multiply, it became clear that the controversy triggered by Sergeant Del Toro's courageous SB speech was no fleeting scandal. It signified a critical turning point, not only for Invictus but for how charitable initiatives could remain true to their missions amidst pressures of celebrity influence, commercial imperatives, and media narratives. Veterans who once hesitated to speak out now stood confidently at the forefront, driven not by bitterness but by a profound commitment to integrity, transparency, and accountability. Del Toro had opened the door. Hundreds followed. They made clear their hope wasn't destruction, it was redemption. They spoke not merely to criticize, but because they genuinely believed Invictus deserved better. Their voices united in one powerful message: the Invictus Games must urgently recalibrate, returning to the genuine support, healing, and dignity veterans once found there. Only then could trust among veterans, donors, and the broader public truly be restored. At the prestigious 2025 ESPY Awards, veteran Sergeant Israel Del Toro shocked everyone by accusing Prince Harry of diverting funds from the Invictus Games, money meant to help injured soldiers, into glamorous Netflix documentaries and lavish travel perks. Tonight, we reveal what prompted Del Toro's explosive claim, why veterans are furious, and the scandal now shaking Prince Harry's reputation to its core.